Welcome and happy 100th birthday to the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I'm Dean Lynn Videcka, and in this centennial year, our school is celebrating the themes of social justice, one of the enduring values commitment of the field of social work as well as the school, and we are celebrating our past, present, and future. Today's special centennial lecture is rooted in these themes as it considers one of the greatest matters of justice historically and in our time. It's my special honor to welcome Provost Susan Collins, who will introduce our speakers. Susan M. Collins is the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Michigan, as well as holding the Edward M. Gramlich Collegiate Professor of Public Policy. Susan is also a professor of economics and a former dean of the Ford School of Public Policy. Susan is an international economist whose research interests center on understanding and fostering economic growth in industrial, emerging market, and developing countries. She leads our university with strength and grace during one of these most challenging times that universities have ever faced. Thank you for joining us today, Susan. Welcome to all our audience guests. And now, Susan, I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And I have to say, I am absolutely delighted to be here marking the 100th anniversary for the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan. And I welcome all of you and thank you for joining us here as well. So as it celebrates its centennial, this school is a wonderful exemplar of how the university fulfills its mission of serving the people of the world through preeminence in creating and applying knowledge and in developing students who will challenge the present and enrich the future. The long-standing recognition of Michigan School of Social Work as our nation's best in the field is a testament to its research prowess and to the many contributions that its graduates make through their practice as frontline social workers, as community organizers, as policy advocates, and in so many other roles. I'm so pleased to add my voice to the chorus of appreciation for the many ways that social workers make a difference in the world, especially in the very difficult times that the pandemic has brought to us. So, of course, a school's success depends on many, many factors, and one that is prominent for this school is a deep engagement with interlocking and overlapping challenges that societies face. So, for example, recognizing the many components that contribute to intergenerational poverty enables researchers to develop the holistic understanding that will lead to policies that improve people's lives. And when students are informed by this approach, they become thoughtful observers of what works and what doesn't work, as well as effective advocates for improvement. So I also want to note the school's connections to colleges, schools, and research centers across the university campus. These connections continue to enrich the university in countless ways and truly contribute to making us, as President Schlissel likes to say, much more than the sum of our many excellent parts. And so I thank the school and all of its members for all of the ways that they engage and just enhance all of the pieces of our campus. The School of Social Work community is committed to continuous learning and the shared exploration of ideas. And this centennial lecture series is a key example of this commitment. And today we are particularly fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from and with William Darity, Sandy, and Kirsten Mullen. I first met Sandy when I was a graduate student in economics at MIT, and I have deeply admired his work ever since. Throughout his distinguished academic career, he has brought a sharp focus and a nuanced understanding to inequalities throughout our society. Sandy's interdisciplinary reach gives depth and power to his analysis of topics including race and educational achievement, labor market experiences and outcomes, and the North-South trade and development engagements, and many more topics as well. Kirsten brings a humanist's knowledge and insight to critical concerns in cultural heritage and preservation. As a folklorist, she has a deep appreciation for the value of stories and has served as a key advisor to projects and programs that preserve and present the stories of people and traditions that have been underrepresented in our cultural institutions. Her service to local and national museums is notable and greatly appreciated. So too are her efforts to engage younger generations to continue this work. Kirsten and Sandy have brought their different yet complementary perspectives and insights together in an important new book, From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And this book has been awarded the 2021 Book Prize from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So it is truly wonderful to have them here with us today as part of the School of Social Work Centennial celebration to talk about their work and to engage us in a conversation of a really important idea. And so it is now my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Sandy and Kirsten. Welcome.
Thank you so much. We are grateful to you, Dean Videka and Provost Collins, for this invitation to join in the celebration of the School of Social Work's Centennial and to engage in a conversation about unequal wealth and the absolute necessity of a program of true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I would like to set the stage by outlining the case for reparations we make in our recent publication. We write, "From Here to Equality draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build in this volume is based on all three tiers or phases of injustice: slavery, American apartheid or Jim Crow, and the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of Black lives. Most advocates of Black reparations have focused exclusively on the injustice of slavery as the basis for redress. Law professor Boris Bitker argued that the case for Black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation, while Roy L. Brooks, also a legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for Black reparations is, quote, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, end quote. We submit that the bill of particulars for Black reparations also must include contemporary, ongoing injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the Black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Sociologist Joe Fagan catalogs the continuing injuries inflicted on Black Americans, including wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal apartheid in the United States and the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, Blacks continue to bear the weight of American racism. That burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system writ large, and a general social disdain for the value of Black people's lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon Black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these three tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination makes a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. In each of these eras, the US government was responsible for the denial of Black people's ability to acquire property, the denial of their right to vote, and the denial of Black Americans' physical protection. We will illustrate how the denial of these rights blocked and continue to block Black American descendants of US slavery's capacity to exercise full citizenship.
The denial of property originates with the period prior to the end of slavery in the United States. During the course of the Civil War, experiments were undertaken with the provision of land to the formerly enslaved, with an expectation that their presence on these tracts of land could demonstrate the capacity of the Black population to engage in productive activity as free people. These experiments ultimately did not result in any significant allocation or distribution of land to the formerly enslaved. So we'd like to talk about two instances in which there was such a failure or a denial of property. The first is in the context of the Port Royal experiment that took place during the course of the war, and the second is associated with General Sherman's allocation of a strip of land originating in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and culminating in northern Florida at the St. Johns River under a special field order number 15, and the fact that that commitment also was not fulfilled. So we'd like to start with discussion of the Port Royal experiment and a process of deceit, outright deceit, that was associated with the execution of that particular project. Okay. So we say on page 135 of From Here to Equality, Edward Philbrick, head of the Boston Concern, a consortium of northern investors that organized to take advantage of the government's land auctions, publicly identified as an abolitionist while contending that Blacks were not ready for the responsibilities of land ownership. For him, the Port Royal Blacks regarded their change of condition with fear and trembling, looking at the cotton field as a lifelong scene of unrequited toil and hailing with delight the prospect of no more driver, no more cotton, no more licking. Without the benefit, in quotes, of whites to drive and threaten them with the lash, the former slaves were unreliable farm workers in his eyes. It was all well and good that Blacks become an industrious and useful laboring class, Philbrick said, but land ownership, at least ownership achieved through a government program based on the premise that granting land to formerly enslaved Blacks was one critical step to right the wrongs of slavery, was not in the country's best interest. Philbrick's group, not the ex-slaves, purchased nearly half of the 16,479 acres of Port Royal land auctioned by the government under the Direct Tax Act in 1863. The group bought it at the unbelievably low average price of less than $1 per acre, and cultivated cotton crops using laborers drawn from the freedmen's population, who were supervised by several former federal plantation supervisors. Philbrick exploited what was intended to be a land reform strategy and economic boost for the contrabands. His effrontery and crassness cost the formerly enslaved about 205 homesteads at 40 acres apiece. Of course, there was no presumption that the productivity of Philbrick and his white partners would be harmed by the opportunity to purchase large parcels of confiscated land at below market prices. Freedmen, on the other hand, allegedly would be corrupted morally by such largesse made soft and unsuitable for work. Better for northern capital to own the Sea Islands than for it, in Philbrick's words, to be abandoned to the Negroes and wild hogs. There's no doubt that northern capital at the hands of Edward Philbrick turned a huge profit on the inexpensively purchased land from the cotton crop raised by the former slaves. Philbrick's private correspondence and his public affairs lend grounds for skepticism about the sincerity of his philanthropic intentions. The former slaves were paid by the job system. In principle, 16,000 Black Port Royal farmers were eligible to purchase 40,000 acres of land at the rate of $1.25 per acre. Claude F. Oubre reports that a single Black collective purchased the land they were working, some 470 acres, at $7 per acre. Although Lincoln instructed the Treasury Department to offer Black families who had lived in the Sea Islands before the war 40-acre plots at $1.25 with 40% down, individuals over the age of 21 were eligible to purchase 20 acres. Secretary Chase delayed the sale and then allowed ineligible whites to purchase the majority of the land for an average of $11 per acre. Advocates of Black land ownership included a contributor to The Liberator, the anti-slavery newspaper, who wrote from Port Royal in January 1864, "If large sums of money can be made at cotton growing, why should not these ex-slaves who have served so long and painful an apprenticeship at this business, now that they should be attaining to their majority, bear their share of the business and thus gather up for themselves some of the ordinary comforts of life and use their surplus earnings to help on their civil, economical, and educational interests?" Another Port Royal correspondent to the newspaper argued that Blacks should be made proprietors of the soil in fee simple as speedily as possible. The writer's urgings may have been informed by eyewitness accounts of the resistance local Black farmers faced when they attempted to negotiate for fair competitive wages at a time when they were not allowed to pursue remedies through the court system. It is going to make a mighty difference to the landless and homeless whether they are to get only the poor pittance of 25 or 30 cents per day and be thus kept dependent, or whether they should receive 4 or 5 times that amount by planting on their own land. The conflict between capital and labor is as old as the world, but in this case, the contest could never be more unequal. So this is prior to the end of the Civil War. On the eve of the end of the Civil War, we have a circumstance in which General Sherman is in the process of issuing Special Field Orders number 15, which is going to assign 40-acre plots of land to the formerly enslaved. This is a promise that also goes unfulfilled. And we'd like to share this portion of the text with you as well. For more than 150 years, American folklore has preserved the tenets of the federal government's promise of reparations to the former slaves, 40 acres and a mule. That promise was not a figment of the collective Black imagination. Rather, it was the centerpiece of another, even bolder federal plan. General Sherman's Special Field Orders number 15 were the directives that first authorized the redistribution of the balance of the land holdings confiscated from or abandoned by Confederates who supported the South against the North during the war, an expanse reaching 30 miles inland from the South Carolina Sea Islands to Florida, and assignment of those lands to the freedmen. Sherman's plan had begun to take shape in January 1865, 3 months before the final battle of the Civil War was fought, when he and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 Black leaders, ministers and church officers primarily, to discuss the plight of the state's freedmen. The leaders selected former slave and Granville County, North Carolina native, Reverend Garrison Frazier, 67 years of age, and a minister for 35 years, to be their spokesperson. He had managed to purchase his and his wife's freedom 8 years earlier with $1,000 in silver and gold. When asked to define the institution of slavery and state his understanding of the Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln had issued January 1st, 1863, Reverend Frazier replied, "Slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man, and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. When asked how the freedmen proposed to provide a livelihood for themselves, Reverend Fraser responded, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. That is by the labor of the women and children and old men, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, the young men should enlist in the service of the government and serve in such manner as they may be wanted. We want to be placed on land until we're able to buy it and make it our own." When asked if they preferred to live among whites or solely among blacks, Reverend Fraser indicated that while he could not speak for the other ministers, he preferred to live among blacks, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. When questioned separately, all but one of the ministers, freeborn Baltimore, Maryland native James Lynch, 26 years of age, indicated that they would prefer to live among only other blacks. This dream of the possession of land and the possession of the land in the midst of an entirely black community was a dream that went unfulfilled. Sherman's Special Order number 15 designated approximately 5.3 million acres of land that was to be distributed to the formerly enslaved. What actually happened? Well, 400,000 acres of land were allocated to 40,000 of the formerly enslaved, although there were 4 million blacks who had previously been subjected to legal bondage in the United States. Out of that 400,000 acres, all of it was restored to the former slaveholders at the behest of President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered. Johnson, who was entirely hostile towards the process and program for establishing full citizenship for the formerly enslaved, took every step he possibly could to reverse the Reconstruction Plan. And one of those steps that he reversed was the land allocation strategy. At the same time, in the western part of the United States, under the terms of the Homestead Act of 1862, approximately 1.5 million white families were receiving 160-acre land grants as a foundation that they could transmit across generations in terms of wealth. And we'd like to definitely give a shout out here to Professor Trina Shanks Williams, who has done the definitive work on the impact of the Homestead Act across generations. And we rely heavily on the research that she's done in the pages of From Here to Equality. But on the one hand, we have a situation in which a significant number of white Americans receive a land grant, or a handout, if you will, from the federal government, at the same time that the formerly enslaved were denied such an opportunity.
One of the things that our research has shown is that Black Americans were extremely excited about the possibility of being able to vote. And I think, for the most part, whites did not really fully anticipate this. They had no real understanding of how much, Black people had been thinking about what it would be like once emancipation came, and how they were making strides and plans, educating themselves, talking in small groups and organizing so that they would be ready when the time came to assert themselves into the American polity. And one of the things that they were looking forward to, at least Black men, was to vote. And we write quite a bit about the denial of the vote to these newly freed Black people. So I'm going to read again from Here to Equality. Not only were Blacks not given the promised 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War, but a white terror campaign that included assassinations of Black political leaders, freedmen, and their white allies throughout the South prevented Blacks from exercising their right to vote and holding official positions. Black elected leaders were tortured and killed, and a host of impediments were established for Black voters. The net effect was the exclusion of Blacks from the policy-making process, inclusion of policies that might have supported and protected Black wealth accumulation and social participation. In 1897, in Hogansville, Georgia, whites, quote, were so enraged over having a Negro postmaster that they tried to assassinate him. Failing in that, they burned his post office. 30 years earlier, in 1868, Benjamin F. Randolph, a Black state senator and prominent delegate to the post-Civil War South Carolina Constitutional Convention, a staunch advocate of Black suffrage and education, and the publisher and co-editor of the Charleston Advocate, a newspaper for freedmen, was executed by the Ku Klux Klan at a train depot in Hodges, South Carolina. The Klan executed white North Carolina State Senator John W. Stevens in a courthouse in Yanceyville in 1870. Stevens had been a member of the Republican Party and the Union League. A former Confederate, Stevens' efforts to organize Blacks in Caswell County, North Carolina, inflamed white supremacists. White disdain for Black life and Black political rights produced the conditions for an intense and systematic level of white racist political violence throughout the states of the former Confederacy. This was particularly true in Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, and Mississippi, the states where Republican Party dominance persisted as late as 1840, almost a decade after the end of the war. After 1873, terrorist white supremacy organizations, especially the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts, pursued their goals of restoring the old racial hierarchy. Intimidation of Black voters with gun and noose became the norm. As Lerone Bennett Jr. recounted, quote, in the big three, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana, Negro voters were so deeply entrenched that nothing short of a full-scale revolution could dislodge them. Southern Democrats were up to the demands of the hour. The white population organized for war. The Negro population at the same time was systematically disarmed by hook and crook on any and every pretext. The homes of Negroes were searched and arms were systematically appropriated. The scope of white voting manipulation during the period was so extreme that had there been an international election monitoring team present, the report would have been a devastating indictment of the process. Again, Bennett wrote, polling places were located in bayous and on islands, in barns and in fodder houses. Armed white men were stationed on the roads leading to the polls to, quote, prevent Negroes from seizing arms, end quote. In one Louisiana county, the polling places were located in an isolated wilderness. The whites gathered at the white church and were told in whispers how to reach the polls. In another county, the polls opened in the dark of the morning and whites voted by the light of a candle. When the Negro voters showed up, the polls were closed for the day. Sound familiar? In Mississippi, white men from Alabama and Louisiana streamed across the state lines and voted early and often. In South Carolina, quote, citizens came from North Carolina and Georgia. Guy B. Johnson, a founder of historical sociology, seeking to characterize the era, accurately declared, Reconstruction was in a sense a prolonged race riot. Johnson reported that General Philip Sheridan estimated that 3,500 Blacks were killed in the South in the decade after emancipation. Johnson's personal estimate, which he described as conservative, was 5,000 during Reconstruction. In 1876, when federal troops were removed entirely from the southern states, Blacks were faced with doom. With rare exception, the right to vote was quashed for Blacks, leading Bennett to conclude, soon the Civil War would be sucked of all meaning and would become an agency of reconciliation between the North and the South. So I want to read a little bit more here. So continuing with the Reconstruction era, in 1874, a decade after Lincoln had launched his doomed Reconstruction plan in Louisiana, the state remained a battleground. In August of that year, racial animosity initiated by whites in Coushatta in Red River Parish claimed the lives of 6 white Republicans and as many as 30 Blacks. With Grant's growing indifference to Southern Republicans, Democratic Party marauders exercised unchecked domination of Black Americans. In his characterization of the 1868 election campaign, historian Eric Foner wrote, "Violence, an intrinsic part of the process of social change since 1865, now directly entered electoral politics." Among the politicians who were murdered during the run-up to the election were Arkansas Congressman James M. Hines, the first U.S. congressman assassinated in office, 3 members of the South Carolina legislature, and several men who had served in constitutional conventions. In Arkansas in 1874, when civil disorder led to white riots, the president's inaction, by then routine, made clear his decision to wash his hands of his party's radicals once and for all. The Mississippi election campaign of 1875, the first year disenfranchised ex-Confederates could vote, united the white population as never before. Quote, "White elites rallied their race across all social classes. The red shirts, the military arm, the red shirts were the military arm of the Democratic Party. They extended the mission of the Klan. These deadly assassins operated in the open and without fear of sanction and succeeded in delivering landslide Democratic victories." The advent of the 1876 election season could not come soon enough for the Grant administration. Disgraced and enveloped in scandal, the president had squandered much of the political capital, not to mention the ideological high ground that had ushered him into office in 1866. No longer championing Black citizenship, Grant and the Republican Party permitted the sword to be put to Reconstruction when Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was deemed the victor in the disputed election. Initially, it appeared that Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, had won. However, the Republicans alleged there had been sufficient incidents of voter fraud and violent attacks of Blacks and Republicans in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida to call Tilden's victory into question. Congress appointed an electoral commission to investigate the election results and declared Hayes the winner. What was not immediately apparent to the American people at large, though, were the terms of the Republican victory. In exchange for the presidency, the Republican Party had agreed to withdraw federal troops from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, abandoning forever Southern Blacks and white Republicans. Soon, the Supreme Court eroded and even reversed the legal measures designed to protect Black rights. Chief among the changes were the diminution of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which granted every U.S. citizen full and equal enjoyment of public accommodations and facilities, regardless of race, color, or creed, and of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, which protected Blacks' right to vote, to hold public office, testify against whites in a court of law, serve on juries, and receive equal protections under the law. These modifications effectively nullified the 15th Amendment and provided the legal cover and sanction for the Ku Klux Klan's full-on intimidation of Blacks and Republicans.
So the use of violence and terror was central to the events that took place in the aftermath of the Civil War itself. So there was a wave of atrocities that occurred after slavery ended. And in the case for Black reparations that we build in From Here to Equality, we pay close attention to the significance of those atrocities. One dimension of those atrocities, and an important dimension of those atrocities, is a series of massacres that took place, both North and South, East and West, between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s in the United States. These massacres frequently involved an effort to suppress or repress the Black vote, but they also had additional consequences that are connected to the theme of our conversation today. In addition to repressing the Black vote, they also resulted in the massive loss of Black lives. And in addition, they frequently resulted in the appropriation of or the seizure of Black-owned property. So despite the failure of the United States government to provide the newly emancipated persons with the 40-acre land grants, Blacks managed to accumulate or acquire some measure of property ownership thereafter. But frequently, particularly in the communities that displayed the highest degree of prosperity, the Black communities displaying the highest degree of prosperities, frequently that property was either razed to the ground, literally, or it was seized by the white terrorists. And so the final thing we'd like to do in this phase of our presentation is share a discussion of the pattern of these massacres with you from pages 216 to 217 of From Here to Equality. So we say the following. 2 years after the Plessy decision, a mass murder took place in the Greenwood County town of Phoenix, South Carolina. The Phoenix massacre began when a white Republican, Thomas Tolbert, set up a stand in front of the polling station at the Watson and Lake General Store and attempted to get Black men on the county's voter rolls. When a group of white Democrats forcibly sought to make Tolbert stop, a fight ensued, and the local Democratic Party boss, J.I. Bose Etheridge, was killed when shots rang out. Although the original source of the gunfire remains unknown, the consequences were tragically predictable. The Democrats retaliated by opening fire on the crowd of African-American men gathered outside the store. Thomas Tolbert was shot in the neck, arms, and side, but he survived. White retribution was swift and severe. In the days that followed, between 600 and 1,000 white men gathered in Phoenix, where they burned the Tolberts' homes and forced the Republicans into exile. Several local Black men were not so fortunate. 4 were lynched outside of Rehoboth's church. Over the next several days, the white mob killed at least 8 Black men, though the exact number is not known. And indeed, the exact number is rarely known in the instances of these massacres, in large measure because no one bothered to keep account since Black lives really didn't matter. No one was ever charged with any of these murders. The Phoenix riot is usually overshadowed in larger historical narratives by the Wilmington, North Carolina race riot that began on November 10th, 1898, and resulted in the triumph of Democrats over Republicans and populists in North Carolina's government. The Phoenix riot occurred in an area that was already under Democratic control. Thomas Tolbert's brother, Robert Red Tolbert, the Republican, lost the 1898 election to Democrat A.C. Latimer by a 996 to 107 margin, despite the fact that Blacks were a numerical majority in the county. A mere 2 days later, the Wilmington massacre itself was underway. Planned and systematically encouraged by white supremacist agitation, the goal of the white conspirators was to overthrow the Republican-elected municipal government. The plotters were drawn from the best class of the city's whites, most visibly including Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate Army colonel who installed himself as mayor after the uprising. In each case, local police forces were implicated as agents of exterminatory onslaughts directed against Blacks. White supremacists who fomented the Atlanta riot that took place in September 1906 and led to dozens of Black deaths modeled their vigilante assault after the tactics pursued by the conspirators in Wilmington. In 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois was engulfed by white destruction. And in the aftermath of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, the grisly Red Summer of 1919 witnessed homicidal white assaults on Black communities in dozens of towns and cities. We estimate that it was somewhere in the vicinity of 35 different communities where these types of massacres took place. And they included Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Longview, Texas, Norfolk, Virginia, Omaha, Nebraska, Charleston, South Carolina, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Bisbee, Arizona. The horrific 1921 massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, raised the prosperous Black Greenwood community, a so-called Black Wall Street, and included the dropping of incendiary devices on Black homes and businesses from decommissioned military planes from World War I. The White Riot, depicted in the 1997 film Rosewood, took place in 1923 in a small town of the same name in Florida. But the white violence in Rosewood was only one of many instances in the bloody state in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Perhaps the most savage in Florida was the Ocoee massacre, a white supremacist response mentioned above to the determined efforts of Blacks to exercise their right to vote. At least 50 people were killed in a single day. Often white soldiers killed Black soldiers on military bases with impunity. The assaults intensified when Black soldiers responded by defending themselves. During World War II, white rioters even drove Black workers out of segregated employment on naval shipyards. Anti-Black riots continued throughout the war and beyond, including in Detroit in 1943 and Fernwood Park in Chicago in 1947. The cumulative toll of Black deaths from the white massacres is difficult to estimate. Between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the 1950s, the lower bound estimate is 700, while the upper bound estimate exceeds 1,500 persons. The uncertainty is attributable to the failure of public officials to have any concern about recording Black mortality accurately, another sign of the depth of worthlessness assigned to Black lives in American society. And we'll stop our portion of the presentation there. Open the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sandy and Kirsten, for those wonderful highlights from your powerful book. To moderate the discussion in our Q&A portion of the event, I want to introduce Professors Trina Shanks and Earl Lewis. Trina Shanks, whose scholarship you already heard a little bit about from Sandy today, is director of the School of Social Work Community Engagement Initiative, and Trina holds the title of the Harold R. Johnson Collegiate Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. Trina is also a faculty associate at the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research, and Trina is leading a new center focusing on equitable family and child well-being in communities. Dr. Earl Lewis is the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy. Earl Lewis is also the director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. Trina and Earl, I turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. If I can ask the first 2 questions and then I'll turn it over to Earl. Throughout the book, you spoke of these critical historical moments where racial inequality could have been addressed, leading to full justice and freedom. So the formation of the Republic, Civil War and Reconstruction era, which you talked a little about in your remarks, New Deal and GI Bill, and then the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Do you have any reason to think that we're in a new moment now? And are you hopeful for a different result? Do you think that there's a greater likelihood today of acknowledgement and redress than maybe occurred in the past? I'll start there and then I'll ask my second question.
I'll speak for myself. I am hopeful. It's partly my personality to be optimistic, but I also, think that we have seen in the last 12, 14 months, publicly, the public has seen many different examples, unfortunate examples of the kinds of abhorrent behavior that Black Americans witness all the time, especially at the hands of police, unarmed Blacks. And I think, the combination of, the pandemic, which brought many people home and slowed things down for some, sped things up certainly for many. But the pandemic, I think, made it possible for these conversations to take place in a way that they might not have. And unfortunately, the conversations, the topic leader is, who's being most adversely affected by the pandemic? Well, it's poor people, and they're largely, Black folks. But the other thing too is we have information about what Americans are saying and talking about, what they're thinking about reparations. We know that 20 years ago, a survey was conducted on this question of reparations. And at the time, only 4% of white Americans supported a reparations program for Black people in this country. 16 years later, that number had increased to about 16%. And then at the end of the summer in 2020, the number was closer to 30%. And in fact, at that same time, younger white Americans, a majority of them, supported a program of wealth distribution for Black Americans. So the trend is moving in the right direction. Now, whether it will continue to do so, I can't say. But I don't know when, I have heard more sustained conversations about the racial wealth gap. I don't know when, was ever a presidential election where serious candidates were raising the question of reparations. Marianne Williamson being the first in January 2019 to utter the R word, and then other candidates were forced, I think, to have to state their own positions on the matter. And while none of them have articulated then or since an adequate program that of reparations, that it even was coming up in conversation, I think was really important. There's also been a lot of discussion about, we had this hearing last year to talk about a reparations program, which we could maybe go into in some detail if we have time. But yes, I feel encouraged.
I think that this is the most propitious moment since the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. That's when we had the real lost opportunity to transform the country. And again, like to share something that we wrote in the book, and this is on pages 161 to 162. We said the following: from fall 1865 to early 1866, many Americans, Blacks and whites, Northerners and Southerners, expected significant penalties to be imposed on the states formerly in rebellion as a condition for their readmission to the Union. When Whitelaw Reid traveled along the Atlantic coast and spoke with a cross-section of residents, including shopkeepers, Black artisans, farmers and planters, Freedmen's Bureau agents and officers, and freedmen in urban and rural areas, and toured several cotton plantations, he observed, it was manifest that if restoration of civil authority depended on Negro suffrage, it would be accepted. Carl Schurz's report to Andrew Johnson concluded, when the news of Lee's and Joseph Johnston's surrenders burst upon the Southern country, the general consternation was extreme. The public mind was so despondent that if readmission at some future time, under whatever conditions had been promised, it would have been looked upon as a favor. So this was the ideal moment to push forward for the full array of Black rights, but it is a moment that was reversed by the actions of Andrew Johnson.
I was thinking too that many in the country have called for a program of true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, but oftentimes the government is not listening. And I think it's really important for us to make our voices heard, to lobby and petition Congress for a reparations program, and to work with both within our official and unofficial groups to which we belong, and to push this agenda. We tend to be interested in projects that our friends and colleagues support, but if they don't speak out, we don't really know what they're thinking. So I think making your opinions known is really important in this moment.
Go ahead, Earl. I'll defer my question until I give you a chance.
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you both. And thank you for this book. It's powerful. It forces open a number of questions. And as we were chatting before we started, I'm teaching a graduate seminar in public policy this semester, so we're using the book and teaching. And so the questions I have come from me, but also from my students who have been anticipating this moment. So I know they're somewhere there on the other side of this webinar looking and said, all right, Professor Lewis, do your job and ask our questions. And so with that, let me start though with a general question, which is to say, in your introduction, you offer the ARC framework of acknowledgement, redress, and closure. The topic of reparations for African Americans, as you've noted, and we heard this afternoon, has a long, and as you note, twisted and somewhat violent history. And so as I was reading the book and rereading the book, I was trying to figure out acknowledgement, yes, redress, possible, closure, and so set against the backdrop of that long and violent history. So for those who haven't read the book, it may be useful just to talk about the framework you started out with and how you get to closure.
There are strings attached to closure. Yes. And, what we say is if no new atrocities, are committed against Black people, and if the old ones are not revisited upon them, then Black people would not make any additional claims on the U.S. government for reparations. That's a big if.
Yeah.
And it certainly would be incumbent upon us, all of us, to be vigilant and to report what we see. What do they say? If you see something, say something. So it's not just a carte blanche. There are responsibilities that go along with that, and closure would only come after the perpetrators and the folks who were wrong, the individuals who benefited from the legacy of slavery that continues today, and the individuals who have been harmed by slavery, Jim Crow, and current and ongoing atrocities would agree that the debt had been paid. So it's not a throwaway.
Yeah, I think we have to link our concept of closure to the particular way in which we think reparations should be executed. We take the position that the Black-white wealth gap in the United States is the most effective economic indicator of the cumulative cross-generational effects of white supremacy. And we point to the fact that Black Americans who had ancestors who were enslaved in the United States constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And so if we were going to have equality in an economic sense, it would require the Black share of wealth to become consistent with the Black share of the nation's population. And this would require an expenditure of $10 to $12 trillion. And we don't think you can begin to talk about closure until that task is fulfilled. That in effect, that the debt that has has gone unpaid for 156 years finally is met. But as Kirsten also pointed out, closure would not be something that would be indefinite unless there was no further renewal of the types of harms, damages, and atrocities that have taken place in the past in some shape or form. And we'll note that there is another example in the United States' own history of a reparations plan that did apparently lead to closure. And that's the compensation that was paid to Japanese Americans who were subjected to mass incarceration at the end of, during the course of World War II. Closure does not mean forgetting. It simply means that the community that's been victimized will not make any new claims on the culpable party.
I was going to say, in the case of the Japanese Americans, there was a tremendous need within the community to have the U.S. government admit that it was wrong. That they had unlawfully incarcerated Japanese Americans during the war, mainly because of racism. They were never able to identify a single case of treasonous actions on the part of Japanese Americans, and yet they were incarcerated anyway, some of them up to 5 years.
Yeah, there were many more fifth columnists among the Germans and the Italians in the United States. There's no evidence of any single instance of fifth column activity among the Japanese community.
Now, it is indeed the case that many whites in California had their eyes on the successful farms that those Japanese Americans owned and operated. And that, quite likely, led to this becoming the solution. But this was not, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing on the part of Japanese Americans. And that was one of the findings of the study commission that was created. This was the Commission on Wartime Incarceration of CWRIC, Commission on Wartime Relocation of Interned Civilians, CWRIC, and that is that is a model that we think should be replicated in the case of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, having a study commission make recommendations to Congress about a program of reparations, what it should entail.
I think, Trina, it's your turn.
Thank you. So this will be my final question before I start giving you one from the audience. But I spent a lot of time thinking about the racial wealth gap. I am perfectly fine with starting with today's adults and kind of doing a financial transfer, particularly if it does lead to shrinking the racial wealth gap. But my thought, particularly Sandy, since you have in the past supported baby bonds, and I've spent time, looking at children's savings accounts, child development accounts, is after individual reparations for today's adults and families in order to look at past atrocities, like you said, from, slavery, Jim Crow, and everything since, would it be still a good idea to have a baby bond or some sort of, for every child born in the United States, to assure financial stability for future generations? And maybe at that point, since we've maybe dealt with at least acknowledging and doing initial redress of historical wrongs, then you can start looking at class. But you have to deal with race first, and then maybe with children in the future, you can look at class and say if you're below a certain income or something, you get additional payments to your children through a child savings account or a baby bond. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's a thought that I share personally. I've always thought that we should have both a reparations program for Black American descendants of slavery and a universal program of wealth inequality mitigation that might take the form of a baby bonds proposal. And of course, as you know, it's not really a bond; it's a trust account for each newborn infant that would be based upon their family's economic resources. But yeah, I've never thought of baby bonds and reparations as substitutes. I certainly have a much richer sense that they function as complements. And but I also must add that baby bonds is not a substitute, in large part because it is not as dramatic an approach to wealth disparity as a reparations plan. The reparations plan wants to erase, or is intended to erase, the racial wealth gap altogether. And that requires us to close the gap at the mean differential between Black and white households or Black and white individuals, whereas baby bonds targets the median as the aiming point for reducing wealth inequality. So baby bonds is more conservative in that sense. But I certainly think we would have a better America if we had both programs.
Thank you. Over to you, Earl.
Okay, I think I'm off mute. And so, question from my students, and this goes from the book. And so they ask, in your program for reparations, you suggest that eligibility criteria for reparations program should include genealogical proof that the recipient is a descendant of an enslaved person in the United States. And they wanted to just puzzle over the question of the burden of proof. And so should the burden of proof be on them to prove their ancestry, or should there be a default that's in the system in a way? And then all the more so given the world of DNA analysis today and all that that represents. And so
we, to respond to the back part of the question first, we absolutely are not, thinking about DNA tests or skin shade tests. This would simply be individuals who could demonstrate that they were descended from at least one person who had been enslaved in the United States. We fully support the idea of a reparations commission, a study commission, setting up agencies across the United States that would be, run by trained genealogists. This has become, and I suspect it will become a burgeoning field, once reparations are on the line. But yes, we think absolutely it would be essential to provide some assistance for these individuals and help them to determine if they are eligible.
Yeah, at no
cost to them. At no cost to them.
There's a question from Robert Taylor. He said, thank you for a great presentation. Could you mention how federal New Deal policies led to greater wealth inequality?
Well, the federal New Deal policies led to greater wealth accumulation for white Americans. What we, have learned, and especially, from a scholar, Ira Katz-Nelson, whose incredible book, When Affirmative Action Was White, has looked at, all the ways that these programs which on paper, were created to serve all Americans, but in fact, in practice, Black people were discouraged, downright turned away from these programs. Everyone who had served at least 90 days in the U.S. military and who had been honorably discharged was eligible, but written into the legislation were guidelines that indicated that the local jurisdictions, the states, cities, banks, the local Veterans Administration would have the ability to determine who would be eligible for these government benefits and how much they would receive. And as a result, across the South, but not just the South, certainly in some of the northern cities as well, Black veterans would be turned away and white veterans would receive, either loan guarantees for a house or free stipends for their tuition and also living expenses, unemployment payments. These were, basically forbidden for Black people, in large part because the Southern politicians did not want to see their way of life changed. They knew that if Black people in the South had the opportunity to receive a real wage, a living wage, and not be under the thumb of oppressive whites, if they had a chance to go to college, that they would do so, and that there would be no one left to run their households. And so they fought it teeth, toe, and nail. One of the other problems that we observe too is that Black people, the Black veterans, there are over 1 million of them who are coming back from World War II. Black veterans could go to the historically Black colleges and universities, but there weren't that many of them, first of all. And so there weren't that many spots, there weren't that many slots for them to take. Many states had only 1 or 2 HBCUs. So, getting to the university was a problem for many. And they were not at all prepared for 1 million Black vets. They didn't have, large dormitories. It's not as if, the veterans could move to the student ghetto and, and live there, and commute to class. But not only that, but the HBCUs had been neglected during the war. When so many Black men had been drafted, and they were largely tuition driven. So they had fallen into disrepair, had to, decrease their faculty members. So ramping up, so quickly was a real problem for these HBCUs. I mean, they were welcoming Black vets, but they simply could not accommodate all of these men who, were ready to learn. They had been involved in training programs in the military. Many of them had dramatically improved their literacy skills, and they were, rightly, anticipating that because of their sacrifice, because of their service, they would be rewarded with these benefits from these government programs. And that just wasn't the case.
So another question, this one stems from your reference to the Superfund idea put out by VP Franklin and Mary Frances Berry. And the question goes that clearly there is a central role for the federal government to play in underwriting a Superfund, but should corporations and institutions that can be documented in any of the 3 periods that you've identified, shouldn't they too have some responsibility to contribute to a Superfund or some part of that $10 to $12 trillion total?
So I don't think we think that they should have to contribute to the $10 to $12 trillion total. If they want to supplement any type of fund of this type with their resources, that would be fine. But they are not the culpable party. They were conducting their activities, however immoral, under a legal framework that was established by the federal government. And so as a consequence, it's the federal government that has the obligation. This is not a matter of individual guilt or organizational guilt on the part of private entities. This is a matter of federal responsibility and obligation. Again, if any individuals want to kick some money into the fund, that's fine. But we have to recognize the magnitude of $10 to $12 trillion. And we have to recognize that that is a sum that really only can be met by the federal government. So for example, if we had a situation in which individuals or private organizations were making contributions on a monthly basis that came to say, $10 million a month, it would take upwards of 83,000 years to get to the $10 trillion mark. And so, I think that there's also just a measure of absurdity to relying upon any other entity besides the federal government.
Well, certainly those corporations could lobby Congress and or hire a lobbying firm to educate the country and the world about the need for this program. Or they could say, we would like to be involved in XYZ federal programs, but we refuse to do that until the federal government decides that it will grant reparations to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I That would be a tremendous push.
There's a question from the audience from Anita C. Are you at all concerned that reparations would accelerate the racism of white supremacists and their fears? This may not be a reason to not proceed, yet is a worry with the potential of civil war so real now.
Well, we don't think that a reparations program can be enacted unless we're in a position where a significant majority of Americans are in favor of it. So yes, you could have a situation where there is the recalcitrant 30% that is hostile and dangerous, regardless of which type of program is established that is specific to the rectification of conditions for Black Americans. And so in the event that a reparations plan is adopted by the government, by the federal government, there would have to be preparation made to anticipate a particularly violent response from that segment of the population. I mean, January 6th, we see the straight line from the lost cause to an attempted coup on the federal government. And so there's no question that there's a segment of the population that could be extremely dangerous in these circumstances. But I think that there must be preparations made for that eventuality.
So we have an anonymous attendee who asks a question. If and when reparations are passed and paid out, then what? Is that considered an endpoint to the racial inequities in this country?
Well, I don't think it will be, I don't believe it would mark the end of racism per se. But if no atrocities, as we talked about earlier, when we're discussing the conditions for which for closure, if no new harms are visited upon Black Americans, descendants of U.S. slavery, and none of the old ones were reinitiated, then yes, go forth and live your life.
There's a quotation from Malcolm X that we frequently invoke, where Malcolm X talked about somebody plunging a knife into his back 9 inches. And then he makes a distinction between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. And from our perspective, the process of stopping the harms that are being conducted is a process of pulling the knife out. Compensation for the damages that have been done by the knife being plunged in is healing the wound, and that for us constitutes reparations. So both have to happen. You need to pull the knife out and heal the wound, but these are not exactly the same processes. So for example, we don't think that reparations payments would necessarily prevent anti-Black police violence from continuing. And so there would need to be another set of policies that were put into place to prevent police atrocities. But we certainly think that if you were to change the wealth position of the average Black household by approximately $840,000, that has some structural implications for the society, and so could be highly transformative. But we certainly don't believe that reparations alone is the sole solution to racial inequality in the United States. But it's a very, very important one.
I was thinking in the case of Japanese Americans, racism and prejudice against them was a reason why they had been subjected to incarceration in the first place. And certainly the Jews who were subjected to the Holocaust also were reviled. But that animus, ultimately was not seen as a reason not to, that animus wasn't seen as a reason to deny them redress. And we think that's exactly what should happen now. You don't say, oh, people aren't going to be upset if we do the right thing. Let's turn that around and say, we want to be on the side of right, and to have the courage to do the right thing, to make the correct moral choice.
There's a question from one of our former students, Chidima. She says, thank you. She's recommending this book to everyone since she first read and listened to it. Her question is, how do Black people and other BIPOC folks come together in solidarity around the idea of reparations? Since this is not a new idea, as your book reminds us. So how to get solidarity, particularly amongst Black, Indigenous people of color around this idea?
Well, that's the important political question, or one of the important political questions. Know that there are communities that are actually supporting reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. In particular, there's a substantial amount of support from the Japanese American community, whose view is they received compensation for a harm and indignity that was inflicted upon them, and they certainly think that it's appropriate for Black Americans. Similarly, I think we're also convinced that that Indigenous Americans have a sustained case, despite certain kinds of accommodations that have been made for a host of treaty violations and the like. We still think that they have a sustained case for reparations, but it's different from the one for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, whose claim we think is anchored on the provision of the material conditions for full citizenship, in contrast with the Native American case, which is primarily focused on attaining sovereignty. But the fact that these are two different cases doesn't mean that each of the communities cannot support one another in making their claim. And so different claims, but certainly claims that can be mutually encouraged by both communities. And so maybe that's the way to go in terms of building solidarity, is mutual support for the respective claims that each community might have.
Just following up on that theme and using the story of Native Alaskans as an example, where coming out of statehood for Alaska, there was a restitution and that resulted in 44 million acres being preserved for Native Alaskans, just under $1 billion, and the creation of 12 corporations. And when my students go, and if you read a memoir by William Hemsley, who played a role in actually crafting that particular program in Alaska, what he says is that the monies actually themselves were fine. The land was very important, but there was still a piece that was missing as we sort of get to closure, which is the ways in which the cultural aspects of being Native Alaskan in America led to a certain sense of loss, and that money and land in and of itself couldn't actually claim. And so that part of reparations that goes beyond, and then just both the financial and the material in terms of land. And so students are saying, what else should we be talking about as we think about reparations if you use the William Hemsley story as a starting point?
Well, I guess I don't know. Let me just say right off that I'm not an expert on the Native Alaskan case. What forms that restitution took and how many individuals benefited. I think it would be
all of them did actually. Everyone who had claim actually benefited through the corporation structure.
Okay, that's helpful. I don't know what, on the face of it, what they were seeking, what they said they were seeking. Were they seeking retribution? Were they seeking restitution, financial restitution? Is it sufficient for them to obtain counseling, to reunite different tribal groups? I'm just saying, what I'm trying to get is, I don't know what the capacity that these individuals had to reconstitute their communities. That would be really important to know and understand, like what they thought they were getting out of this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people, will say, well, reparations for Black people should involve a series of programs, or maybe even land. That Black people should be given, since they didn't receive the 160-acre Homestead Act grants, land grants, they didn't receive 40 acres. Maybe they should be given land, but everyone doesn't want to manage land. This is which is why we advocate for direct payments to the eligible recipients. But I'd be interested to know what what these Native peoples thought they were getting, and what kind of processes they were putting in place to achieve wholeness, if that was their goal.
Mm-hmm.
Even Frederick Douglass at one point, initially Frederick Douglass was actually against reparations.
Yeah,
he changed his mind when he saw what the consequences were of the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40 acres. And at that stage, he made the observation that there's no way you could actually pay folks for the damages that had been associated with an atrocity so grievous as enslavement. But then he also said, yeah, exactly. He said that the fact that you can't meet you can't find a sum of money that's adequate doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And so it certainly may be the case that there may be things that are left unsettled or untouched as a consequence of a reparations plan, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be executed. And the way we've been thinking about this is to really ask, what was it that our ancestors were wanting to see the world look like for them in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War? And that world was one in which they anticipated and wanted to have land of their own, have the capacity to participate fully in the political process, and largely be left alone. And those three things didn't happen. And so we're thinking that restitution in the form that we're describing might make it possible for people to have the option to do that. But it should be a matter of individual discretion as to whether or not, say some people may want to repatriate to the continent. We hear some people say they want to do that. Well, they could do so with the funds. Some others may have a desire to become landowners or landholders, and they could use their resources for that purpose. People could choose to do things collaboratively or cooperatively. Others may not want to do that. And so that would be a matter of their discretion. But we really think that our perspective is really anchored in trying to answer the question, what was it our ancestors wanted to have happen, and what didn't happen that they wanted to have happen?
I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions. That one asked about if you don't do baby bonds, how can you get to that bigot of gap? So going from 144,000 or so for white families and like 10 to 12,000 for Black and Latinx families, and how can you shrink that any way other than something like baby bonds? And if you give,
I don't understand the question.
Yeah, I don't either. So I'm going to go to the next one because they asked if any financial distribution goes, should it be only set aside for asset building purposes? So rather than being able to be used for everything, should it be for a home, a business, education, things that can kind of be explicitly asset building, or do you think it should be for anything? And then another question, similarly, once reparation comes through, what about other government benefits? So do you have to pay taxes? Should you be eligible for welfare? What about dealing with education debt? So one question is, should any money that's given be only used for asset building purposes? And even once reparations happens, what about all these other government programs?
Yeah, okay.
So we find it interesting that this question of what should the recipients of reparations be allowed to do with that money? When you look at the case of Japanese Americans who received restitution for their wrongful incarceration in World War II, and you look at the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust, when you look at the 9/11 terrorist victims, even the families whose loved ones were killed or injured in the Sandy Hook school shootings, there were no directives about how they would spend that money. The funds were given to them directly. Now I should let me back up and say, in the Sandy Hook case, there were there was a lot of discussion, because initially the funds were going to several different organizations, including the United Way, and the families were exercised about this. They said, this is an atrocity. We should be able to decide if we want to open a foundation in our children's name, or if we want to donate funds to create a recreation center. And it was striking that Ken Feinberg, who was the special master assigned both to the 9/11 Commission, 9/11 Fund, and also to arbitrate at Sandy Hook, came away from both of those programs and saying absolutely direct payments to the eligible recipients is the way to go. And and we believe that should be the case of Black Americans as well. It's intriguing to us that when the potential the eligible recipients become Black Americans since U.S. slavery, suddenly we need these strings attached. We need some intermediary, some other group to manage these funds for these Black Americans, and Black Americans since U.S. slavery. And we would say, well, no, they should be allowed as well to have control of those funds. Now, which is not to say that you wouldn't necessarily also have some funds or portfolio funds that might be available. I'm saying we're talking about Malcolm X's program, Malcolm X's analogy of the knife being pulled out of one's back. If you pull the knife out 3 inches, that might be a series of programs that an individual city might inaugurate. If you pull it out 6 inches, that might be some community's decision to make college tuition free or less expensive. But those things by themselves or collectively are not going to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And that's the target that we're keeping front and center.
Yeah. Now, just one proviso. We actually say in the book that, and this is distinct from limiting how people might use the funds, but the funds might be given to people in some other form besides direct cash transfers. It's possible to give people the funds in a form of a less liquid source of resources, so that you're actually giving people, in some sense, you're compelling them to take an asset. But that's different from telling them how they should deploy the funds from the asset. And we definitely don't think that should be part of the game.
And unfortunately for all of us, we've reached that time, which is to say we're getting little dings here to say that our 90 minutes are already up. And it has been tremendous. And there are more questions out there, which is to suggest that we may have to find another reason and occasion to bring you, if not at least virtually, back to Ann Arbor, and hopefully at some point in real time. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I'm going to second that suggestion, Earl. I want to bring Sandy and Kirsten back for more discussion, and I want to endorse everyone getting a copy of this wonderful book. Thank you so much, Sandy and Kirsten, for writing this important book, for coming together with us today. And thank you to Trina, Earl, and all the question askers for leading such a lively conversation. I have a few more recognitions and thank yous before we say good evening. I want to say to all the faculty, students, alumni, and friends who joined us for this important conversation today, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. I'm giving a special shout out hello to Ann Unger, who's in the audience. I want to thank, an event like this doesn't happen without a lot of people contributing to it. First of all, I want to thank Robert Taylor and the members of the Changemaker Planning Committee, and that includes Rachel Hawkins and Marvin Parnes, who have been with us today, for the idea to invite Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen as part of our celebration. I want to thank our wonderful communications team led by Lisa Raycraft for all the beautiful publicity and communications about the event. Our flawless IT team, including Tom Smith, who shepherded our IT perfectly today. And finally, last but not least, I want to thank our development team and especially Emma Krasaniak, who tirelessly and creatively organized this event. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.